We're in 1 Peter chapter 2. 1 Peter chapter 2. If you want to open your Bibles there this morning, this is a fun text to walk through if you like to irritate people. And so I'm walking through this book verse by verse, so therefore you're going to be irritated with it today. I expect some of you will be. And then next week, I will irritate even more people, so be prepared for that. But it's not simply me. It's not from me and what I have to say. It's from what God has for us and what he wants us to learn and grow from. And so I just want to point out God's word. And we're studying through 1 Peter and simply being challenged to pivot from the normal way of living to the new way in Christ. And so that's what the goal is, and that's why the series is entitled Pivot. And in our text today, Peter is calling us to pivot our reactions. Pivot our reactions. You understand what a reaction is, right? A reaction is simple. It's just something that we do. It's caused by some sort of external circumstance. When someone says something hurtful to you, you react or want to react, right? When someone steals something from you, you want to react. When someone cusses you out, you want to react. That's a reaction, right? When someone annoys you, has that ever happened to you? Just a little bit? You're tempted and you want to react. That's reactions. Reactions are simply, it's based on some external circumstance of something around you that's pushing in, and you feel like, I gotta say something, I gotta do something, I need to react. And there's different reactors, right? Let me illustrate. We all, this is Dr. Pepper, unopened Dr. Pepper, and it's under pressure. You could feel it by squeezing it, and there's still pressure here. We all are under a bit of pressure in life. That's normal, right? But when we're shaken, some external circumstance, this isn't my Dr. Pepper, so I don't have to worry about whether it's bad or not at the end of this message. But when someone shakes us, some external circumstance hits us, and we're shaken up, and inside the pressure is building, there's three different responses that are typical. One is passive. Here's what passive does. Passive keeps the lid on and holds it in for dear life. And I don't want to let it out. I can take it, and I'm just holding in, and I'm not going to let it out. That's passive. I won't ask for a raise of hands or anything that says I'm a passive kind of a reactor when something happens at work or at home or in the community or church even. I'm passive. And there's a lot of people that are simply passive. They keep the lid on for whatever reason. And then there's the opposite, the aggressive, right? Here's what the aggressive does. Sorry if you're sitting up front, but the aggressive, when they're shaken up like this, they go and okay, I'm not going to really do that. You're waiting, and he's moving back, and why did I choose the front seat? Anyway, the aggressive, they're like, I've got to let this pressure out. The pressure's killing me. So you open up and you just let it go. And that was a fun joke in junior high school, to give somebody a can of soda, right? And say, hey, here's a bottle of Coke. I got it just for you. Or a can of Coke. And cans are way better than bottles because you shake it up really good. You've never done this, I'm sure, but I have. And you shake it up really good. And here, have a can of Coke. Appreciate it. And you back up because you know what's about to happen. They pop the thing open. Oh, man, thanks a lot. Pop. And as they pop it open, the pressure has built up so much that it just explodes on everything around them, especially the person that's opening. And that's what an aggressive person is like. That aggressive reaction where they're just shaken up, and inside it's like, oh, I'm boiling. And it doesn't take much because they're already under pressure, right? And then that aggressive person's like, I got to let you have it. I got to let you know this is how it is. This is the way it needs to be. I'm going to let you go. And they just open up. And as they open it up, what they're unaware of is that it's hurting them, affecting them, and affecting everyone around them. Now, a passive thinks that it doesn't affect anybody because they just hold it in. But a passive person is destroying themselves inside and destroying the potential of relationships outside of that. That's a whole nother message. But I'm just kind of giving you... Now, there's the third. This is such the Christian way of doing things. It's not. The passive aggressive. I'm shaken up, and here's what I hold it in, and I hold it in, and I can't take it anymore. And then you let loose. Passive aggressive. You know, I would say the passive aggressive is the most scary. Here's why. If you're around a passive aggressive person, you never know when they're going to explode. Aggressive people, you just know. I deserve that. I knew they were going to do that. It happens. A passive person, you're like, I have no idea what they're thinking, but they just don't say anything. They have a funny look about them, and they twitch a little bit here and there, and you kind of, it's whatever. But the passive aggressive, you're just never sure. Today might be the day where you broke the straw that broke the camel's back, and maybe one of those you would identify with more than the other. Maybe you're passive aggressive, maybe you're passive, maybe you're aggressive, maybe you wish you were more of one or the other. These are the typical reactions, and Peter is literally, he's challenging us to pivot away from these natural reactions that we have into something different. I don't want to convince you if you're passive to be aggressive, or if you're passive aggressive to be aggressive or passive, or if you're aggressive to be, that's all three of those really don't coincide with the truth of what it is to be a follower of Christ. That's just normal. Everyone responds in one of those three ways. But Peter's calling us to something different, and that's where the pivot comes in. To pivot our reactions. And so I want to help us to do that. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 18. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 18. And by the way, in this message, some of you will be tempted to react to me. Before you do, just listen. Just be passive for a little bit before you do. Okay, anyway. Jokes, bad. Verse 18. Verse 18. You remember the pivot from last week? Last week we talked about this, and the pivot was we want to pivot from being an American to being an ambassador in America. That was the pivot point. Okay? And today it is certainly as deep, if not deeper than that, and it all stems from a relationship with Jesus Christ. Because of what he's done, that's why we pivot. It's not just a religious ideal, it is because of what Jesus has done. And so in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 18, he says, servants. Now, who's a servant? Well, if you're reading in the New International Version, the NIV, that says slaves, right? Okay, so a servant or slave, properly understood, has a lot of different understanding to it and application for then and for us today. A servant in that day, that specific servant, is describing a house servant, literally. It's someone who is, and you would say slaved, has been bought to be working at the house all of the time, and so you would look at it more precisely as slave. Now, servant and slave, they can be synonymous in some ways. And so in that culture, it was very common to have a servant at home for people that had more money, and that was a normal kind of way of handling certain like debt issues and things like that. So that was a normal way of living. Now, from a general perspective, if I'm going to be more precise, that's where he's honing in. From a general perspective, Jesus says that he came to be a servant. He came to serve, not to be served. And so in relation to that, he then applies it to us and says we should be servants also. So in this, we could apply it generally to every one of us. And generally, as Peter is speaking, he could then give it as an application to every single one of the people that are listening also, because we're all called to be servants. Now, specifically, it's going to get a little bit tense when we deal with this specific application of what Peter or who Peter is talking to, for various reasons, and you're going to see this. And servants, he says. And by the way, just because he notes slavery, this is really important. He is describing slavery, not prescribing it. He's talking about it in the sense of not condemning it. And he's not commanding it. Some people really struggle with slavery in the Bible, and I understand why. There's a lot of context to this, and I want to not spend all of my time on one word here while we could spend a lot of time here. While we look at this in our culture, we look at this slavery and we say, Peter, you should be condemning this. Peter was not looking for an insurrection. Peter was not calling for a revolution at that time. Peter was talking to people that were living in a culture that was just the culture that is. So I don't want us to take it as Peter's saying something positively or negatively about slavery. He is simply addressing the culture that is. Do you follow me? Okay. I will say, by a simple application from God's word, that's not the way God designed for people to react and care for each other. And slavery, by the way, today is more prominent today than it has ever been. The average slave today in outside of America is sold for about $90 or bought for $90. And slavery in America, there is a major slave industry going on in America and around America that is a very sad thing that's just totally overlooked. That's a whole nother message for another day that could really be a mini-series, but it's a sex slave industry that is just rampant and horrible in our culture and in the cultures around us. That's very real and very, is really happening today. But let's move on from that. So he's talking, and you can apply it there, but you can apply it more specifically to where we are. So he says, servants, slaves, be subject to your masters with all respect. Be subject to your masters with all respect. To be subject is to put yourself under their authority with respect. It's you're making a choice to respect them because of their position, even if they are not a respectable person. He says, put yourself under their authority with all respect, and giving them the respect because of the position, not necessarily because they're a good person. And he describes this then after that. Not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust. So he's describing both. And this gives me a lot of tension and agita as I read this text, to be honest. It's very challenging to even preach it because it frustrates me to read it. Because in my American mindset, the way I want to read this is, he says, servant, be subject to your masters with all respect. Fine, I'll do that to the ones that are good and gentle. But to the ones that are unjust, think about this, the ones that take advantage of. This is the billionaires that take advantage of the people that are on welfare. This is the people that are taking advantage of and abusing and hurting and doing damage to people that they're just in control of. It just gives me agita just to think about this. Like, really? Peter, you're saying to be subject to that one? Don't you feel it? We would be of the same mindset because that's where we are. He says, to the good and gentle, and to the unjust. In the last year, in my life, this is the first time I've ever seen anything of this magnitude, we've seen all kinds of protests in America specifically, and it's been throughout the world, but in America specifically, we've seen all kinds of protests for various different things, but the bottom line of every single, I believe, of most, if not all the protests is injustice. Is that people are marching for injustice, that something wrong has happened, and so there's a march to bring about change, to bring about an understanding or an awareness that this injustice is happening. And so we look at this, and in our culture today, we look at this and say, this is tough, Peter. Like, really? You're going to say to the people that are experiencing injustice, that they have people that are just lording over and hurting them, you're going to say, be subject? Really? But that person hurt them and continues to unapologetically hurt them and take advantage of them. But Peter, really? Yeah. So that's the tension. See, injustice is simple. It doesn't feel right. And we want to react. So the question is, what do we do with that? The imperative that Peter gives is be subject, to put yourself under the authority of your master with all respect. But that's not the pivot point. The pivot point is different than that. Being subject is simply what happens as a result of the pivot point. So let me highlight the pivot point, because the imperative is be subject, and that's the challenge over here. But the pivot point back here is what drives us to be there. And we find that in the next verses. He says in verse 21, verse 19. I skipped over a couple verses. He says, verse 19, "For this is a gracious thing." It's a picture of grace. Grace is a gift that's given to someone that deserves punishment. So to be subject to your master, the ones that are good and gentle and the ones that are unjust, regardless of which one it is, it's a picture of grace that you would be subject and give respect to the one that is your authority. Not that they deserve it, and that's grace, it's that you are giving it. So simply, here's the whole point of the message. I'm going to say this several times. Here's the pivot point. He calls us to pivot from getting justice to giving grace. Pivot from getting justice to giving grace. It's not about, our drive is not simply, I want to get justice. It's that I want to give grace. And that's the pivot point here. He says, "For this is a gracious thing when," and here's where it comes from, "mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. For what credit is if when you sin, you're beaten for it, you endure? But if when you do good and suffer for it, you endure. This is a gracious thing in the sight of God." And he gives a very clear understanding that there's the one that they don't obey and they get beaten for it. And he's honestly speaking of getting beaten for it. Okay, so that's where it leads me into. This is a slavery thing. This is not a willful employment like you look at New Jersey's laws of, hey, you can't do that to me, I'm going to sue you. It's not that kind of a culture. It's worse than that. And so he says there's the one who, when they do good and they're beaten, that's the one that's being treated unjustly. There's the one that they mouth off and they get beaten. Look, you that suffering, that's not gracious. You deserve that one, sort of. Do you see the tension there? And so he's giving a picture of grace, and he's saying here, this is a gracious thing. He says it twice, in the sight of whom? In the sight of God. That God, who's always present everywhere, God is literally watching our lives, watching us go through our employment, watching us go through our living at home, our living in our community, or living wherever we are. God is watching us. So in the sight of God, as God is watching, he says, this is gracious when you submit with all respect. Now, some would call this weak. Some would even say, that seems so passive to me. And so you're calling us to be pacifists? No, not at all. That's not, I don't see that's what Peter is conveying in any kind of way. I would look at this more precisely, and I would say, which is easier, to let loose on someone that is being mean to you, or to control your tongue and be gracious? It's easier to let loose for most of us, right? So Peter is calling us to the hardest thing, to the strongest thing. When I'm disrespected, when I'm not listened to, when I'm taken advantage of, pour out grace. Give grace. In order to give grace, it takes a lot of thought, doesn't it? In my heart, and maybe you're like me, there's a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde inside all of us, isn't there? Right? Where somebody's just, they're getting on my nerves, and I want to just, they cut me off in traffic, and and I've got these reactions going on inside of me. And here's the reality. And he says, this is a gracious thing. Grace says, I'm going to give you this gift. And the gift looks like a horn or looks like I'm going to tell you, I'm going to give you peace of my mind. And you need to hear this. And that's what I want. And God says, no, that's not grace. That's just, you're trying to settle the score. That's your calling out and trying to get rid of this injustice. It is unjust for you to cut me off at $2.95. So I'm calling you out. He says, give grace. So instead, what that means is I back up and I say, okay, Lord, I can't do this. Dr. Jekyll or Mr. Hyde, I always forget which one's which, but this one, it's steering me the wrong path. But God, I need you to reign over that. So it's making a choice with our words and our actions as to what we will do. It's a gift that we are then giving, even though it was an injustice done to us. We are turning around and we're giving this gift back. Romans chapter 12, Paul speaks of this in Romans chapter 12. See if I can get there quick. Verse 19, he says, beloved, verse 18 is better to start there. And this whole text really does just lend into those. He starts with, bless those that persecute you, bless and do not curse them. Rejoice with those that rejoice, weep with those that weep. He goes down, if possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. To the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, here's the gracious thing to do, feed them. It's not, you deserve that, finally you get yours. If your enemy is hungry, feed them. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. For by so doing, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. So Paul's saying the same thing, and it demonstrates it a little bit further. So here's what he says then. In verse 21, for to this you have been called, this is our calling, being Christ also suffered for you. Now he's ratcheting back and he's saying, look, it doesn't come from me, Peter. This comes from Christ. Because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example. You don't understand what an example is, right? It's kind of like dot to dot that you give to a kid and say, trace this out. Or it's giving them a piece of trace paper that you put over top of this other thing, say, trace this out. It's the same thing. It's here's your trace paper, here's your life, model it exactly as Jesus has done. And so he says he's leaving you this example so that you might follow in his steps. Here's what he did. He committed no sin. Neither was deceit found in his mouth. So he didn't do anything wrong. He was perfect in everything that he did. Verse 23, when he was reviled, he got cussed out, he got yelled at, he got talked down to, he got demeaned. He did not revile in return. He was not passive-aggressive or passive-aggressive. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but he continued to do this. Here's the grace aspect. He entrusted himself to him who judges righteously. So instead of vengeance and chasing after injustice, what he did was he entrusted himself to the one who judges righteously, to the Father in heaven. And he says, listen, I'm not going to trust in man or woman or whoever. I'm entrusting myself to God the Father who's going to take care of me. That didn't look so nice for Jesus, did it? Here's what he says in the next verse. He himself, verse 24, he himself bore our sins in his body on the tree. That's grace toward us. And he did this on what? On the tree, on the cross, right? That we might die to sin and live to righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. So the righteous judge handled Jesus in a way that Jesus went to the cross for you and I. That he allowed for Jesus to be the payment for our sin. He says, by his wounds you've been healed. It says, for you were straying like sheep, but now you've returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. He gives the real example. It's not Peter. Do you remember where Peter was when all this happened? He was the one denying Christ. I never saw him. I didn't know him. And he's sitting at the foot of the cross, or just a distance away from the cross, looking at Jesus after the denial. And he's watching as Jesus is giving up his life, and these moments had to come back to him as he's writing to people and saying, listen, I know you want justice for the unjust. You want to make this happen. I know you're under a tough circumstance, but let me tell you someone who is under a worse circumstance. Jesus comes for the people that they didn't want him around, to the degree that they made things up about him. They brought him to 3 trials and had him put to death, even though they found no guilt in him. This was serious business. And Jesus goes through all of that injustice for you and for me. So we are the recipient of his amazing grace. And if we were there, we would probably be chanting with the crowds, crucify him, crucify him, crucify him. We probably would join in collectively like, you know what? He really is a jerk. What did he do wrong? I don't know. He just is. Right? And we join in because everybody else was doing the same. But his grace is extended to us just the same. And if it's extended to us, we have created this injustice toward him. Then, by application, Peter is saying, we should give grace rather than get justice. Because what Jesus did was, Jesus said, I will resolve the injustice myself by paying the price for their sin, taking on your sin into my body, going to the tree, going to the cross. And by his wounds, we are healed. We don't get healed. But just as an aside, healing does not happen when justice is served. It doesn't happen when justice is served. That just says justice is served. When someone hurts you and does something wrong to you, when justice is served and they are found guilty and have to pay the price, healing does not come there. It opens the door for some healing, but that's not the end of it. Jesus provides healing that's way beyond, saying that all men are sinners, all people are sinners, and the only one that is righteous is Jesus Christ, and by his grace he comes giving all of us grace. And so then we are able to turn back to him and say, Lord, thank you. And our response in our reactions to others then comes out with giving grace rather than getting justice, is what he calls us to. So grace then is this. It's not passive, and it's not aggressive, and it's not passive-aggressive. Grace is an active gift of truth and humility. It's an active gift of truth and humility. It sees the truth of the injustice. Isn't that what Jesus did? I see the truth of the injustice. I see the truth of what you've done. I see this. And at the right time and place, which is what Jesus did, grace sheds light on the truth, not as a reaction, but as an action toward reconciliation. And that's where we speak into it. You see, it's not passive that I just bottle it up. And it's not aggressive that I just let loose. And it's not passive until I get to a point where I can't hold it anymore, and then it's aggressive. No, it's a deliberate action where I look at the truth and I look at the injustice, and it may not be in my lifetime that I even see the outcome of this. But then over time, in God's prescribed way and time, we give grace and we give grace and we give grace so that we can bring about reconciliation. That's what Jesus did. His whole point of coming to earth was not to prove that he's right. It was to provide for reconciliation. Because of Jesus' example then, Massive statement, right? Because of Jesus' example, we need to pivot our reactions from getting justice to giving grace. Tomorrow, we celebrate Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s day. And within that, one of the messages that he shared that comes out of the book Papers of Martin Luther King Jr., Volume 6, and it's a message entitled Man's Sin and God's Grace. He says this. I'm just pulling a clip out of this message, and it's really good, and then we're going to conclude from this. He says this, I'm about to conclude now. I know you say, now you stand there on a somber note. You've said to us that we are sinners. We are caught in the clutches of sin in our personal lives and in our social lives. And yes, if we stop there, I assure you that we would be in a pretty tragic predicament. That man's life would be a life of nothingness, a life of endless pessimism, so that we can't stop there. And that's something of the beauty of the Christian faith. That it says that in the midst of man's tragic predicament, in the midst of his awful inclination towards sin, God has come into the picture and has done something about it. That's the beauty of our faith. It says that standing over against the tragic dimensions of man's sin is the glorious dimensions of God's grace. Where sin abounded, grace abounded even more exceedingly. Isn't that awesome? Where my sin abounded, God's grace abounded more. That's the Christian faith, he says. On the one hand, it is the most pessimistic religion in the world. Why? For it recognizes the tragic and awful dimensions of man's sin. And it does, because we say, all have sinned. We say that in my heart, my motives, I look at my own heart, and it's deceitful and desperately wicked. I say that about me. Right? That's the pessimism within it. He says it recognizes the tragic awfulness and awful dimension of man's sin, but on the other hand, it is the most optimistic religion in the world, for it recognizes the heightening dimensions of God's grace and how God's grace can come in and pick up. So that over against man's sin stands God's grace. Christianity, therefore, becomes the greatest pessimistic, optimistic religion in the world. Isn't that good? It is a combination of the pessimistic optimism. It sees over against man's sinfulness, man's tragic state, the graciousness of God's mercy and his love and his forgiving power. God's grace stands over man's sin. And he goes on a little bit further, and he closes out this message by referring to a song that is really an interesting song for him to refer to. We're going to sing this in a minute. Rob's going to sing it for us. Probably one of the, if not the most famous song in the 20th century, Amazing Grace. Amazing Grace. In our hymn book, it's on page 343, Amazing Grace, and it's written by John Newton, is the one that the pastor that kind of had it written, and then alongside of him would be William Cowper, and the origin of the music itself is unknown. It's to some sort of a popular tune, and I want to talk about all three of those things. John Newton, you have to know a little bit about his background. He was in charge of a slave ship where they transported slaves. And so he was in charge of this. And at one point in time, he came up upon a storm and thought his life was over and about died. And at that point in time, he surrendered his life to Christ. Totally changed. He came to the grace of God. And in that, he never got over that moment. And from that, years later then, he writes back about that in this song, Amazing Grace, in a song that he was preaching then about where he was at. Now, John Newton was not that great of an individual for a long time, and it took him a long time to come to the other side and to say that slavery was wrong. So that's a little bit about his background. But the writing of this is tremendous, and the fact that Martin Luther King Jr. sheds light on this song says a lot about grace. Because written by a slave ship operator. You catch that? That's that we've all sinned. And because of God's grace, we all can receive his grace. And God does amazing changes in our life. The song my speculation. No one really knows the origin of the musical notes. Here's my speculation. My speculation is, and I've had other people say this, so I'm influenced by others in saying this, that I think that John Newton, when he was singing this for the first time in his service, remembered on that ship the people that he enslaved, hummed this song together. And I wonder if John Newton looked back at that time of his life with serious regret, looking at the pain he caused others. And this song was the resolution to that as well. Amazing grace. How sweet the sound. Rob, would you sing that for us a little bit?
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see.
When I listened to the words of the song, and I put this whole text and everything into its proper place, here's what I hear, and this is for us now. You ready? If Peter's writing to slaves that were experiencing abuse, and I'm just going to go out to a limb and say that I don't think anyone listening today or here today is experiencing the same pain that they were experiencing. It's not that no one in our culture does. I'm just saying for us, our application. In our American history, slavery in America produced something really fascinating called the songs Negro spirituals. Tremendous history behind them, and it affected music, the history, and it's another story. During that period where slavery was real, the only way they got through the day, a lot of times, was to sing these songs to each other. Now, horrific past. My point is this. If people in horrendous situations are called to serve their masters with all respect, as Jesus did, then us who struggle because we feel like we're the only ones that do the dishes around the house, and we're serving and we're bitter, and it's an injustice that they should be doing the dishes, they should be picking up after themselves, they should do this, and this injustice that we want to just lash out in. I mean, it's so minuscule, wouldn't you say? That in our homes, and if our boss says, I want you to do this, and I'm going to take the credit for it, and it's an injustice, and how dare you? And I need to tell somebody that we reflect back and we extend grace to our spouse, to our children, to our parents, to whoever it is, our boss, and we extend grace because we pivoted away from our passive-aggressive and passive-aggressive so that we can give grace in every situation, because that's what Jesus did for us. That's when God becomes chief in our life. It's a huge pivot for some, because we say, but what about the injustice? And I say, entrust yourself to the Father who judges righteously. That's what Peter said. So we should do the same. Let's pray. Lord God, thank you so much for your grace. Lord, this is such a heavy text to practice out, to understand that, Lord, that optimistic pessimism, where we are sinners prone to sin, prone to being passive or aggressive, and prone to just living out our flesh. But Lord, we want to live righteously because of you. Thank you for the gift of grace you've extended to us. And so give us the strength to do exactly as you've called us to. And we'll give you the praise. Through Jesus, I pray. Amen. As we go, could you sing the last verse? When we've been there 10,000 years bright, shining as the sun, we've no less days to sing God's praise than when we'd first begun. You don't have it? There we go.
We've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun. We've known that days to sing God's praise, and when we first begun.
Amen. Amen. Thank you, Ron. As you go, extend grace. Give God praise. Do it now, because in eternity you'll get to. Do it now, no matter what situation you're in. Hey, thanks so much for joining me today. Have a great week.